05 unit, Section 5, key events relating to the consequences of the war. What happened at the end of the war? Well, you have a period known as Reconstruction. Reconstruction is defined as rebuilding the South economically, socially, politically, and physically. There are two plans of Reconstruction. One, presented by Lincoln, and then after his death, 5 days after the Civil War, he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. His vice president, Johnson, takes over and continues his plan. Lincoln and Johnson's plan of Reconstruction was known as the 10% plan. They were going to require that 10% of Southerners stand and recite an oath of allegiance to the United States, and if they would do so, then their state could re-enter the Union. Many in Congress believed that this was a lenient policy. To contrast the presidential plan for Reconstruction was the Radical Reconstruction Plan, or mostly led by the men in Congress who felt like the South should pay more dearly for causing the Civil War. This plan is considered more harsh. This plan was referred to as the 50% plan, and it's also known as the Wade-Davis bill. Radical Republicans in Congress passed legislation. Because the president that replaced Lincoln was a Southerner from Tennessee, he opposed many of their radical plans. So much of their legislation he vetoed. This did not make the Radical Republicans very happy. Over Johnson's objections, Congress was successful in passing much legislation which helped ex-slaves. The first is the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment granted freedom to ex-slaves. The radicals in Congress were also able to pass legislation over a federal program known as the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau provided food, land, medicine, shelter, and education for young ex-slave children. But most importantly, what it did is it led to something, it forced the Southerners to give up some of their lands to their ex-slaves. And this leads to a system in the South known as sharecropping and tenant farming. It also, I have a picture for the sharecropping. This is where a white Southern farmer would be forced to give up part of his land and share it with his slave in exchange for part of that ex-slave's crop. Another technique used by Southerners was called tenant farming, and that is where they would charge their ex-slaves rent to be able to use that land. The problem with sharecropping and tenant farming is that it led to perpetual slavery, which basically for me means the slaves did not have chains on, but they lived in such a state of debt that they could never get off the plantations that they had been slaves on. One of the other things that the Freedmen's Bureau did was start a college in the South, specifically in Georgia, known as Morehouse College. And that was begun in 1867, and that was to provide education for young African-American men to become preachers. The 14th Amendment, passed in 1868 by Congress and the states, granted African-American citizenship. This is going to overturn the Dred Scott decision. And then in 1870, the 15th Amendment is going to grant the right to vote to African-American males. Andrew Johnson was not looked well upon by radicals in Congress. He was a Southerner from Tennessee. He had been rewarded with the vice presidency by Abraham Lincoln in his second term in order to gather votes from the southern states, the southern border states that had retained their slaves. And Andrew Johnson was impeached by the Radical Republicans for breaking a law called the Tenure of Office Act. To be truthful, they used that as a technicality. He was really impeached because he opposed their plans for Reconstruction. He was such an unpopular president. He was able to escape being found guilty by the Senate, so he was not convicted, but he was so unpopular that in the 1876 election, the Democrats choose Samuel Tilden, and the Republicans choose to not go with Andrew Johnson, but to go with a man named Rutherford B. Hayes. When the election, the Democrat Samuel Tilden actually garnered the most votes, but because of a disputed vote count in the state of Florida, a electoral commission of 11 men were going to choose which candidate would receive Florida's electoral votes. On this committee were 6 Republicans and 5 Democrats. The 6 Republicans chose Rutherford B. Hayes. This leads to the Compromise of 1877. The Compromise basically said the Republicans promised that if Hayes could be elected president and the Democrats would not fuss about it, that the Congress promised to remove all federal troops from the South. Well, this means that Reconstruction is effectively ended. That does not mean, however, that when Reconstruction ended in 1877, it does not mean that everything was happy-go-lucky in the South. The South used many different techniques to keep ex-slaves from actually being able to enjoy the new freedoms that they had won. Here in this document, it's actually a literacy test that Southern states would give to ex-slaves, ensuring that they would not be able to vote. It would keep them from being able to vote. They also used poll taxes, which were very discriminatory. They would charge both whites and black people a fee to be able to vote, but they would allow the white people to get around it by something called a grandfather clause, which said that if your grandfather could vote before 1861, you were excluded from paying the poll taxes. The slave codes that existed before and during the Civil War are extended with something called the black codes. Here is an example. These are black codes from the state of Mississippi. They were used to regulate the lives of the free black men and black women in the South. They were used to regulate their lives after Reconstruction ended. It's the way that Southerners controlled their ex-slaves. Here's a chain gang, and ex-slaves oftentimes were found guilty a lot in court and would have to serve long prison sentences. Another way that whites discriminated against ex-slaves in the South was a vigilante group known as the KKK. Here's a artist's cartoon of the KKK and how they're working with other whites in the South to keep African Americans subjugated. Supposedly the KKK was started by this man. This is Nathan Bedford Forrest, the namesake of the movie Forrest Gump. And this is a page taken out of a catalog where you could order you a Klan outfit. And I just thought that was pretty interesting. This concludes Unit 5, Section 5, key events that led to the consequences of the Civil War.